This video is for Level 2, Chapter 7 Macro Practice Exercise. There's nothing wrong with what they cover in the book, but macros are very involved and I usually spend 2 to 3 weeks on them, so I want to give you some more information. Mostly this is just more practice. So on page 2 and 3 of the handout, I'm going to create 5 macros and then I'm going to edit some of them, delete one of them, and show you how to work with macros. So you want to be in a blank Excel workbook. I didn't say that in the directions. What a macro really is a series of step-by-step directions. So anything you do repetitively, if you do it the exact same way every single time, that would be a good reason to have a macro. So the first macro is create a macro to type your name in the current cell. So I click on any cell. Make sure you do not hit enter or click outside of the cell once you start creating the macro. Click on View tab. Macros is the last button on the right. Click on the macros down arrow, and one of your options is record macro. And once you start recording the macro, it will record every single thing you do until you hit stop recording. So make sure you pay really close attention to what you're doing and don't do anything more than you absolutely have to. Record the macro, do the steps, stop recording. So I'm going to start this macro. I click on record macro. Macro names are up to 64 characters, no spaces, no dashes, no periods. They're a lot like range names. So if you get an error where it says it's an invalid name, usually it's because you put a space or a dash in it. So make sure there's no spaces or dashes. Macro names can also not be a cell address. There's my macro name. Here's my description. Hit OK. Now I am recording the macro. This is not easy to see. The only way to tell is down on the taskbar. Next to ready, there's a square. That means you're recording a macro right now. So do not click anywhere else and do not hit enter. Just type in your first name. Do not hit enter. Click on the check mark on the formula bar. Now I'm done with the macro, so to stop recording, I click on the macros down arrow again and click on stop recording. And now this button is changed back to, it looks like a little spreadsheet, but basically this is the record macro, stop recording macro button. Now in reality, you should record a macro and then test a macro. And in the directions, I went through recording a bunch of macros and then through running a bunch of macros. So I'm going to record it and then run it right away, just to make sure it works. So to run a macro, I click on the macros button, not the down arrow, but the macro button. It gives me a list of all my macros. So there's my macro called my name. There's my description. And then I click on run, and it runs that macro in whatever cell I'm in. Click on another cell, click on macros, macro name, run, and it runs that macro in whatever cell I'm in. If you get an error in your macro, the easiest thing to do is to re-record the macro with the same name, and then it'll overwrite the existing macro. We'll do that later. So the second macro, create a macro to put the current date in A1. I'm still on page 2. So I'm going to click on record macro. Macro down arrow, record macro. So here's my macro name, here's my description, hit OK. Now I am recording the macro. So for this one, I want to go to A1, so do Control Home. That puts your cursor on A1 because you want the macro to do anything that you want to happen repetitively. And then no matter what cell I'm in, it will go to A1. Now I'm going to insert the formula for today, so click on FX. Category is date and time. Function is today. And hit OK. And hit OK again. Now what I want to do is format this as a long day, so while it's still selected and I'm not clicking anywhere, I go to Home. On the numbered group, I click on the down arrow for number format and choose long day. So what it does is it formats the information in A1 as a long day. I'm still recording the macro, so to stop recording, go back to View, macro down arrow, stop recording. Third macro starts on page 2. Create a macro to type Ames Community College in A2. So again, I click on any cell. The other way to record a macro is click on this button here. So here's my macro name, here's my description, hit OK. I am now recording the macro, as I can tell by a little square down here. So the first thing I want to do is go to A2, so Control G is go to. And then I type in the cell where I want to go, and I want to go to A2 and hit enter. Takes me to cell A2, and then while I'm in A2, I'm going to type Ames Community College. And because I'm already in A2, I'm going to hit enter because it's just going to go from A2 to A3. And then stop recording, I can also click on this button down here next to ready, and that will stop the recording of the macro. So if I click on the macros button, I can now see I have 3 macros. It puts them in alphabetical order, so there's aims in A2, there's the description, date in A1, there's the description, my name, there's the description. Remember, your macros are saved in your workbook, not on your computer like they are in Word. Fourth macro is on page 3, create a macro to turn on print grid lines. So to create a macro to turn on print grid lines, I'm just going to create the macro, turn on print grid lines, and then turn the macro off. Before I do that, I'm going to go to print preview, just so you can see the print grid lines are not on. So I do not have print grid lines, I do not have a header or footer. So I'm going to record the macro. I'm going to click on this button down here. So here's my macro name, here's my description, hit OK. I am now recording the macro by my little square. So to insert print grid lines, click on Page Layout. Under Grid Lines, turn on Print, stop recording the macro. Make sure you stop recording. That's probably the most important thing. People forget to stop recording, and then they go on the internet, they go to Facebook, and it records all those steps. So if I go to Print Preview, just to test my macro, I can see there's my print grid lines. On page 3, create a macro to insert the sheet name in the header. This is similar to what we've been doing all semester. So I'm going to create my macro, click on the button down here. So there's my macro name, sheet name, and header, and there's my description, insert sheet name and header. Hit OK. Go to Insert. I'm doing my normal steps to insert a header and footer. It automatically puts me in the center of the header, so all I have to do is click on sheet name, and it puts in the code for the sheet name. Now I'm going to click someplace in the worksheet, click on Normal View, and stop recording. And to check it, I go to Print Preview. Here's my grid lines, there's my header. And if I change my sheet name and go back to Print Preview, then it changes it up here as well. So I'm going to make another sheet and run all those macros again. So I'm going to click on a blank cell, go to View, go to Macros, list all my macros in alphabetical order. So I'm going to click on my name, and then to run it, you just click on Run. Or you could hit Enter since Run is the selected option. And I'm going to insert my name in a few places just so that I know it works. Next, I'm going to run the macro date in A1. There's my macro name, there's my description, hit Run. So from whatever cell I was on, it goes to A1, inserts my day, there's my formula, and formats it. Much quicker than I could have done. Click on another cell. I'm going to run the macro aims in A2. Goes to A2 from whatever cell I was on. Types the names Community College, and hits Enter and goes down to A3. I'm going to click on another cell again. I'm going to go to Print Preview. If you added the toolbar buttons up in your Quick Access toolbar, you can just click on Print Preview here. I do not have Print Grid Lines turned on, and I do not have a header. So I'm going to run the macro Print Grid Lines. And now I'm going to run the macro sheet name and header. It doesn't matter what order you do this in. Now if I go back to Print Preview, Print Grid Lines is turned on. My sheet name is in my header. And like I said before, if you have an error in a macro, a lot of times it's easier just to recreate the macro than to try to fix it, because to fix it you have to know Visual Basic. And I will edit one macro in a couple minutes, but unless you know Visual Basic, it's just easier most of the time just to recreate a macro. So let's say I don't want a macro with just my first name, I want a macro that includes my first name and my last name. So now I want to replace the existing macro called my name with the new macro, so that the macro my name, instead of just showing my first name, it shows my first name and my last name. So to replace a macro, you just create a new macro with the same name. So I'm going to record new macro. So I created the macro with the macro name my name, which already exists, my new description, hit OK. And it gives me the error message, macro with name, my name already exists, you want to replace it. So again, it's easier to replace an existing macro than it is to fix it oftentimes. So hit yes. So now the macro called my name is empty. Now whatever I do is going to be my new and improved macro. So I'm just going to not click on anything because I'm just going to do it in the current cell. In the current cell, I'm going to type in my full name. Again, don't hit enter. And don't click on another cell. Click on the blue check mark and stop recording. So now if I click on another cell and run that macro, my name. So my new and improved macro has my first name and my last name, it does not change anything that's already out there. So whatever was in the cells when I ran my old macro is still the same. You can edit a macro. Again, you need to know Visual Basic, so it's easier to edit macros where it's very, very simple revision, like something is spelled wrong, because everything in Visual Basic is written in that specific programming language, and like colors, red wouldn't be showing up as red, it would show up as a hexadecimal number. So we'll go over how to edit a macro now. So on page 6 it talks about Visual Basic code. So when you're editing a macro, change what you know, don't change things you don't know, because you could be deleting things that are really important to the macro. So I'm going to edit Ames in A2 and change Ames Community College to be Ames State College. And I'm going to do it in the macro so that every time we run the macro, it will give me the new and improved information. So it doesn't matter what cell I'm in. Click on macros, click on Ames in A2, happens to be the first one, click on edit, and this is Visual Basic. It may show up as a restored window like this. Just click on maximize and then you can see everything. So what it does is it lists every macro you created. This is the most recent one, date in A1, Ames in A2, print grid lines. Anything that's blue is a keyword. That means this has to be there and it has to be spelled this way. So sub is the beginning of this subroutine. Macro name is date in A1, end sub is the end of that subroutine. This is the beginning of the next subroutine. Macro name is Ames in A2. The next macro is called print grid lines. Anything that's green is a comment. That just means it's information for you to read, but the program isn't actually going to do anything. So the macro name is here after the word sub. The macro name is also here in comments before the word macro. So if I scroll down to the bottom, the first macro I made was my name. So that is at the bottom of the list. Anything that's in black is a command. Macro Ames in A2, type in the text Ames Community College. This is in quotes, so I can tell this I can change because I can actually read it. So I'm going to change Ames Community College to Ames State College. So I just select community, type in state. And then to save it, in the book they say click on save. Really all you have to do is click on file, and then the last option, close and return to Excel. Now, right now A2 says Ames Community College, so if I were to run the new and improved macro, click on macro, click on Ames in A2 run, goes to A2, types in Ames State College. On the practice sheet is still Ames Community College. You should always delete macros that are no longer useful. Click on the macros button. Gives you a list of all your macros. So if I wanted to delete Ames in A2, I just click on it and click delete. And then it says, are you sure you want to delete it? I say yes. There is no undo. Once you delete a macro, you've deleted it. Most important thing, when you're saving a macro workbook, you need to save it as a macro-enabled workbook. That way, when you open it later, you can still run those macros. If you do not save it as a macro-enabled workbook, next time you run it, your macros are all gone. So click on File, Save As. I'm going to put this in my normal directory. Make sure you change Save As Type first. Choose Excel Macro Enabled Workbook. It's the second option, XLSM for macro. And I'm going to name it Chapter 7 Macros Last Name. Now if I close it and then get back into Excel and open that file, you should have the option of Enable Content. Click on that. And when you go to View, click on Macros. It should list all your macros. So, having said that, what I want you to do, and this is just insurance for me, is to save all the macro directions in a Word document. This way, if your macro doesn't save for whatever reason, I can still see it, and I can still run it and see if it works. You click on any macro name, click on Edit, takes you into Visual Basic, click anywhere in the Visual Basic window, do Control-A, that's Select All, copy, you might need to do Control-C, minimize this, and get into Word. Create a new Word document and paste the macro directions. This way, if anything happens and your file doesn't save, or I can't see the macro directions or the macro directions don't work, we had a problem with this in class, so it could be depending on where you saved your files or how your computers are set up, it may or may not save the macro directions correctly. And then save the Word file as Chapter 7 Macro Directions Last Name. And then what I need you to do is upload the Chapter 7 Macro Directions Last Name, which is your macro in Visual Basic, and also your XLSM file. So I want you to upload both those files. Macros will be on the last test. Thanks.